controversy, I guess you could call it controversy, has been building around Prime Video's Rings of Power series for a while now. Either due to purist nerds pushing back against its casting diversity, or just generally trying to adapt Tolkien, or a general disdain towards the visuals, there's been plenty of backlash. At the end of the day, I will say the biggest hurdle to the Rings of Power is that it has to get past climbing out of the shadow of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Peter Jackson's trilogy is considered not only to be the high watermark in terms of adaptations, but it is also viewed by many as the definitive interpretation of Middle-earth. That said, the development of the series did have its own pushback before release. On top of that, it wasn't the first attempt to adapt Tolkien's work. I want to look back at the different interpretations that have come out, or almost came out, over the years, and how they have been received by the masses. Let's do this. Alright Internet, so with this video I'm going to try and cover as many of the different Middle-earth adaptations as possible, but I might have missed out on a couple. Oops. And if I did, you can nicely leave a comment about it. Emphasis on nicely. So in dealing with something as beloved as the world of the Lord of the Rings, there have been a lot of adaptations, both successful and failed. And I want to look at both here, just because I think there is something that can be learned from the failures as much as the successes. And by successes, I mean successfully put out an adaptation, not that they were necessarily good, but we'll get into that. Before we got any film adaptations, what we were getting was radio dramas, which makes sense both for the era that was a more popular medium at the time, but also you just get quicker turnarounds from an audio drama than a film. The first radio adaptation was done by the BBC in 1955, just a year after The Fellowship of the Ring was published, and the same year that Return of the King came out. It was a 6-part adaptation that covered the first book, and then the next year they did another 6-part to cover the other 2 parts of the trilogy. Wild. I also find it funny that the adaptations are called The Fellowship of the Ring and The Lord of the Rings, as if Fellowship isn't part of the main series, it's just the Hobbit of it all, which is its own... You get what I'm saying. Now, I couldn't find any real reviews of it, or the audio itself, because the BBC didn't really hang on to that kind of stuff back then, but there were some quotes from Tolkien on it, from the 1981 Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien publication. He didn't like it, saying things like, "I think the book quite unsuitable for dramatization and have not enjoyed the broadcasts," as well as, "I think poorly of the broadcast adaptations. Except for a few details, I think they are not well done, even granted the script and legitimacy of the Enterprise, which I do not grant. 10 on 10, perfect adaptation." Now this isn't the only radio play adaptation of the series we got, nowhere near it. One of the more notable adaptations was by The Mind's Eye for NPR. It came out in 1979 and ran for 24 episodes, and then had a follow-up adapting The Hobbit in 1980. Because what is The Hobbit if not a follow-up to The Lord of the Rings in every medium, despite a 1937 publishing? Deal with it. The Mind's Eye version is a pretty good adaptation. I have managed to listen to some of it.
This is the ring?
The rumors that you've heard are true. Sauron the Great, the Dark Lord, has arisen again.
It's a bit of its time in terms of what it's doing stylistically, but that's not a bad thing. This version is pretty well regarded now, and that's in part because it is the only adaptation to feature fan favorite Tom Bombadil at all. Even though it's not actually true, technically, Bombadil is in the 1955 one, and that portrayal is one of the things Tolkien hated about it. That said, the 79 one is, like I said, lost to time, so technically this is the only adaptation that we can get our hands on that has it. And this NPR version has a strong following, but it is not the most popular radio adaptation of the work. That title goes to the 1981 adaptation, which was a second adaptation done for BBC. This 26-part version is so beloved in part because of its higher audio quality than the previous ones. And because of that, you're getting a good piece of media. And a good piece of media is better. Shocker, I know. It's also a fairly faithful adaptation. It tries to be as true to the source material as possible, but there are still a few changes and omissions, Bombadil included, and that's just something that comes with adaptations. And I want to stress, I do think adaptations to another medium should make changes. Different forms of media have their own things that do or don't work in terms of storytelling and pacing and how characters are portrayed to the audience, all that kind of stuff. So to try to do a one-to-one transfer from mediums just doesn't work. You're going to have to change something at some point. Not to mention that adapting allows you to update certain things that are of their time and don't really resonate in the way that they did then, now, and it allows you to freshen things up to our more well-understanding climate. And while I get that major changes can be upsetting to purists, the hardcore fans that want an exact one-to-one translation are setting themselves up for disappointment. Back on track though, I do think that there are other radio adaptations of Middle-earth, at least The Hobbit, but it's hard to find information on them, they're not well documented, so I think we can move on from that and get into film and TV now.
The next day.
There have been so many attempted screen adaptations of Middle-earth over the years. First up, there was an attempt from Walt Disney to do The Hobbit back in 1938. That's a year after both the book's publication and the release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, so it's prime time for the old Walt man. Apparently he also wanted to do a Lord of the Rings feature in the 50s, but it seems like he was talked out of that one. The New Yorker once wrote about the attempted Disney adaptation and said that Lord of the Rings lacked the kind of humor that audiences expected from Disney animation, and that any attempt to alter Tolkien's story to inject such humor might result in bad will and vocal resentment amongst Tolkien devotees. And that's something that I wish Disney would do with some of their live-action films now. Everything is built off of their trendy, quippy, one-liner humor that works in some Marvel stuff, but doesn't work in every film. So, in 1956, old Johnny Tolkes was approached twice to adapt his epic. I regret calling him that. One of the people to approach him was Al Brodax, an animator probably best known for his work with the Beatles on Yellow Submarine and the lesser-known Beatles animated series they had. This never seemed to get past a basic discussion phase. Also, the Beatles are going to come up again. Forrest J. Ackerman's attempt got as far as sending Tolkien a 55-page treatment that was not well received. Tolkien liked the art, and I should mention this was also going to be an animated adaptation, but he was not a fan of the changes alluded to in the treatment. And from what I've read, I can see why. I'm one to generally defend creative choices in adaptations. I did so just a few minutes ago. But this went a bit too far. The change that really got me was they were going to have Sam leave Frodo with Shelob, just abandoning him and taking the ring up to Mount Doom himself. It shows such a lack of understanding of the characters at their core. And that's something that an adaptation needs to do well. If you're going to make changes, they have to be changes that are true to the characters and the story. Even if it deviates, even if it changes, as long as things at their core make sense, you're golden. So after that, from 67 to 69, Tolkien was in various negotiations with United Artists because they wanted to get into the fantasy game after the success of the films being made by Ray Harryhausen at the time. We also have Apple Films, no corporate relation, who wanted to adapt The Lord of the Rings as a multimedia musical extravaganza, and it would have been their third film from their contract with, you guessed it, the Beatles, from earlier, those guys. There's been dispute over the band's general casting, like who would play who, but from what I can tell, it would have been Paul McCartney as Frodo, John Lennon as Gollum, George Harrison as Gandalf, and Ringo Starr as Sam. All fine choices. They also wanted a big name director attached to this, and they approached big name directors. David Lean, Antonioni, and Stanley Kubrick were all given the option to do it, and in some way or another turned it down. Kubrick went so far as to saying The Lord of the Rings was unfilmable. The guy who made this said something was unfilmable. And that is a big sentiment of that time. Peter Jackson and Ralph Bakshi, who did an animated adaptation a few years later, which we'll get to, have both spoken on that. Jackson doesn't think it would have been doable at all for the time, while Bakshi said it would have been doable, but would have been very tacky. So the Beatles version never happened, although it did come back again, or almost came back again, with the four of them playing the four hobbits, but that never happened either, which I'm fine with. The last thing I want to cover in this section of failed adaptations is a script written by John Borman. If you don't know, he's a filmmaker who went on to make Deliverance, Zardos, and Exorcist II the Heretic. I know. He wanted to make an Arthurian epic, but when he approached the studio, he instead got hired to adapt Lord of the Rings. And to say he made some changes is accurate, but underselling it. It seems like his script would have been a single 3-hour adaptation of the entire thing. Bad call. Added plenty of surrealist aspects to it, which is something that the director is quite known for, as well as a whole list of things I'm just going to put on the screen right now for you to read while I go get a glass of water. Okay, so there have been 3 successful animated adaptations of Middle-earth stuff. 2 of them by Rankin Bass, the stop-motion Christmas people, and the other by the man, the myth, the legend himself, Ralph Bakshi. The first one to be made was the Rankin and Bass adaptation of The Hobbit from 1977. It was well received, with the writer Romeo Mueller winning a Peabody for his script. Though on the critical side, it has been said that it is not a good adaptation for people unfamiliar with the source material, and there has been some stuff said that people don't like the animation by Japanese studio Topcraft. And I get that you can say that the animation looks a bit janky, but I think that there is a very storybook charm to the visuals that they put together. And I assume that's what the goal was. A few years later, the team worked together again on an adaptation of Return of the King that came out in 1980, and they did not capture the same magic a second time. While it has the same visual style as the Hobbit adaptation, it doesn't quite work as well for the story being told. They do make it a bit darker, and there are moments in the film that work, but I do think overall it just doesn't feel like it should. I can't imagine it working if they had completely changed the look either, because it is connected to a prior film, but they needed to do something here. Also, the working title was Frodo the Hobbit 2. Perfect, no notes. I'm not sure why they decided to adapt just Return of the King and not anything else from its trilogy, and the changes that had to be made to retrofit everything and make it all make sense together is a big part of the problem. Arthur Rankin Jr., one of the directors on the film, went so far as to say, "The Return of the King, we had to summarize what had happened before, and then put it all together in 2 hours. It's not a very good film." The Return of the King is also often mistaken as a sequel to Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings film. It's a mistake that makes sense. Bakshi's adaptation came out 2 years before The Return of the King, and it covers both The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. The film was a long-time passion project of Bakshi's. It's something he had been trying to get off the ground for years, went through so many different stages of development. I think at one point he was given the Borman script to work off of, which he did not like, but he just kept getting at it. I think the best description of it is the one critic who said, flawed but inspired interpretation. A lot of the early parts of Frodo's story are taken out or condensed so that way you can focus more on the Fellowship's story as a whole, which is the bigger part of everything in the adaptation. There is a ton that can be said about Bakshi and his work on this project, and luckily Dan Olson has already put a video out on his channel, Folding Ideas. I'm going to link it so that way you can watch that instead of me just doing a poor summary of what that man did.
One pair of pants later.
And this finally brings us to the Peter Jackson films. We are not covering the stage plays. There are few people in my life that I have talked to about these movies that have not praised them in their entirety. And even the criticisms that I've gotten from people are more nitpicks than anything else. But there are Tolkien historians who look down on this work. While discussing Jackson's work, David Bratman said, "Condensation is not the issue. The evisceration of Tolkien's spirit is the issue." And that's really the point I'm getting at here. The trilogy of films, some of the best fantasy ever put to screen, the high watermark that all adaptations are judged up against, evisceration of spirit. And much like we're experiencing with the talk around the Rings of Power now, the trilogy has plenty of detractors online before it even came out. I found a great post on Reddit that collected a ton of forum complaints about the Fellowship of the Ring before it came out. I'll link it below. Complaints that came out before the film's release included criticizing the poor performance Ian McKellen was clearly given, and, surprise, surprise, political correctness. I could have made a much easier video if I just sat down and read all of the ridiculous complaints from this post, but I've already filmed all this, so we're not going back now. Alright, internet, so am I saying that we have to love the Rings of Power before even seeing it? Obviously not. What I am saying is works, especially adaptations, will always be trashed before they come out, especially things like casting of actors. If you want the purest form of a book you love, read that book. There's nothing wrong with that. And if you can't fathom the idea of an elf with a skin complexion darker than mine because of the way one old guy from the 30s described them, I feel sorry for your lack of imagination. All I want is for us to be able to look at the show when it comes out critically as its own piece of media. It's going to be telling its own story, and while I'm not a fan of everything I've seen from it so far, I think the costumes look a little too clean, for example. Not so much the design, but just like not a lot of stuff looks as lived in as it should be. And that's a critique that I also had with The Wheel of Time, also on Prime, when it was airing. So we'll see. Also, I'm not going to be covering the Hobbit adaptation stuff here, despite the fact that there is so much to talk about, because you can just watch the series of videos Lindsay Ellis did, and don't worry, I'm going to be doing something Hobbit related later this year. And that is it for this video. I hope you liked it. It was a lot of talking about a lot of old stuff to get to a very small point. But I think all that context just helps make that point. And if you thought all that context was helpful, like I did, you can leave a like on the video, you can comment on the video, you can share it with your friends, all that stuff. Let me know if you're excited for the Rings of Power. The first 2 episodes should be out at the release of this video, so let me know your thoughts in the comments. I've got another video coming out in a couple weeks for you nerds, and until next time, have a good one.